in the sample database, I have this table TBL product inventory which has got the sample data, and now I want to display this data within an ASP.NET Web application. We have seen how to do this in the past using SQL command and SQL data reader objects. In this session, we'll see how to achieve the same using SQL data adapter and data set objects. So let's flip to Visual Studio. Here I have a simple ASP.NET Web application project which has got this webform1.aspx. Let's drag and drop the grid view control, which can be found under the data tab in the toolbox. Let's auto format that. Okay, so we have this grid view control. Let's flip to the code behind file. So in the page load, let's write the code to load the data from SQL Server and display that in the grid view control. First of all, we need to have the connection string to the database. I have the connection string within my web.config file. The name of the connection string is dbcs. So the data source is dot, which means the local SQL Server. The name of the database is sample. Integrated security is equal to SSPI, meaning I am using Windows authentication with the SQL Server database. And the provider is system.data.sql client because I am interacting with Microsoft SQL Server database. So let's go ahead and create a SQL connection object, but before that we need to specify the connection string, and we know that we have the connection string in web.config file, so I have to read it from there. And to do that, I can make use of the configuration manager class. We have spoken about all these steps in the previous sessions of this video series. So configuration manager dot connection strings of, we need to specify the name of the connection string. So let's copy it from web.config file, paste it here, dot connection string. So we get the connection string. Now we need to create a SQL connection object. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection, and the constructor expects the connection string to be passed in. We already have the connection string, so let's pass that to the constructor of SQL connection class. Okay, now if you want your connection to be closed in a timely fashion, you can either do that in a finally block, or we can use the using block, which ensures that the connection is automatically closed when the connection object goes out of scope. We don't have to explicitly call the close method on the connection object. Alright, so we have the connection object ready. Now what we need to do is to prepare the SQL command, but in the previous sessions we have seen how to use the SQL command and SQL data reader. In this session we are going to use SQL data adapter. And if you remember, when we create an instance of the SQL command object, it expects, if you look at this SQL command, when I create an instance of this one, if you look at this, there is a constructor which takes two parameters, the command that we want to execute and the connection upon which we want to execute that command. Now when I create an instance of the SQL data adapter, let's call this DA is equal to new SQL data adapter, I have one overloaded version of the constructor of this class which takes in the command that we want to execute and the connection upon which we want to execute that. So it's exactly similar to the way we create a SQL command object. Okay, so let's specify the command. The command that I want to execute is this one. So let's copy that. And the connection upon which I want to execute this data adapter, this command, is con. Okay, so I have the data adapter. Now we need to create an instance of data set object. We will talk about data, working with data set object in detail in the next video session. Here let me introduce you to data set, and by the way, data set is independent of the provider, so it's not present in system.data.sql client namespace. It's present in a namespace called using system.data that is common to all the providers, all the .NET data providers. Our .NET data provider for SQL Server, which is system.data.sql client, .NET data provider for Oracle, which is system.data.oracle client, along the same lines OLEDB and ODBC.NET data providers. The provider specific classes, we know that they are present in that provider specific namespace, but the data set is provider independent. That's why it's present in the system.data namespace. Okay, so data set, let's call this ds is equal to new data set. So we are creating an instance of the data set. Now if you're wondering what a data set is, a data set is an in-memory representation of your database. We can treat it like that. A data set can actually store tables and the relationships between them, just like how a database would store tables and the relationships between them. But the database tables are actually stored in the hard disk, whereas this data set is present in the memory of the web server. And if you want, you can cache that, which we will actually look at in the next video session. Okay, so for now, understand data set as an in-memory representation of your tables. Okay, so now we have the data adapter and the data set, which is capable of storing tables in memory for us. Okay, so now I want to, fill this data set with data from this TBL inventory, TBL product inventory table. And to do that, all I'm doing here is on the data adapter object, I'm going to call a method called fill method. Now most of the work is actually done by this fill method. Now if you look at this fill method, it is expecting a data set to be passed in as a parameter. So I'm going to pass this data set to that method. So now what is this method actually doing? This method is the one which actually opens the connection to the database. Previously, when we were using the SQL command and SQL data reader objects, we were required to open the connection before we execute the command. Okay, but for data adapter we don't have to do that. Okay, all you have to do is call the fill method. The fill method will take care of opening the connection, executing the command on the SQL Server database, reads the data and then fills that within the data set and closes the connection immediately. So the connection opening and closing is managed by the data adapter for us. We don't have to open the connection, nor do we have to close it. Okay, that's automatically managed using the data adapter object for us. And the connection is kept open only as long as it is required. Okay, just before it executes the command, it opens the connection, executes the command, reads the data, fills the data set, and closes the connection right away. Okay, so I have the data set now. All that is left out is to use that data set as the data source for our grid view control. So grid view1.data source is equal to data set and call the data bind method. So grid view1.data bind. Alright. So now if we go ahead and run this application, you should actually see that data. As you can see, the data is retrieved and displayed on the web form. Alright, so we have seen how to execute a SQL statement, an inline SQL statement. And we have seen using SQL command objects, we can execute, using SQL command and SQL data reader, we can execute stored procedures. So is it possible to execute a stored procedure with SQL data adapter? Absolutely. So let's go ahead and create a stored procedure first. So let's say I have this procedure, create procedure, sp, let's call sp get product inventory as the name of the stored procedure. So let's press F5, command completed successfully. Now if we execute the stored procedure, we have the result. So now we want to call the stored procedure from within our ASP.NET web application. So to do that, all you have to do is copy the name of the stored procedure instead of the ad hoc SQL statement. Copy paste the name of the stored procedure. And another important thing that we have to do is we have to tell the data adapter that it is executing a stored procedure. Now even if you don't tell that, if I just run this as it is, all I have done until now is instead of the inline SQL statement, I have copy pasted the name of the stored procedure. So if I run this as it is, the SQL data adapter figures that it's a stored procedure, executes that, gets the data. Okay, but then it's a good practice to actually specify in the code that it is executing a stored procedure and not an inline SQL statement, because if you try to execute a stored procedure that has got parameters, then you anyway have to specify the command type as stored procedure. Okay, so da.select command, because this is the select command. Remember, the data adapter can also update data. It can update, insert, delete. It can do all DML operations. Okay, in this session we'll only see how to select data. In a later session we'll see how to update the data, update the database from the data set using the data adapter's update method. Okay, so data adapter.select command, the command type is actually a stored procedure. Okay, so now if we run this, the result is would exactly be the same, except that we are specifying the command type is stored procedure. Alright, so we have seen how to execute a stored procedure that doesn't take parameters. Now let's see how to execute a stored procedure using this data adapter object that takes in a parameter. Now let's say I have a text box wherein the user can actually type in product ID, and then let's drag and drop a text box control. So a user can type in the product ID, and let's say there is a button called get product. Okay, so when he clicks that button, he should get only that product, for which he has entered the ID in this text box control. So within the click event, we want all this code. So let's copy and paste that within the click event handler. Okay, and let's write a stored procedure which takes, a product ID and then returns that product. So let's call this sp-get-product-inventory by ID, and select star from TBL product inventory, where product ID is equal to, we need to pass in a parameter to the stored procedure. So let's create that product ID integer and specify that parameter in the where clause. So let's create this procedure, execute that. Command completed successfully, so the stored procedure should have been created. Let's quickly test this. Let's pass in product ID 1, press F5. Okay, I get the product. Okay, so now let's try to execute the stored procedure from within our ASP.NET Web application. So the first thing that we have to do is copy the name of the stored procedure that we want to execute, paste that here, and we specify this is actually a stored procedure using the command type property on the select command object, property of the data adapter object. Okay, and the next thing is, obviously you have to pass in a parameter to the stored procedure. Okay, so to create the parameter and pass in, the way you do it is da dot select command dot parameters dot add. So if you look at this one, you can pass in a SQL parameter object. We have learned how to create an instance of SQL parameter object when we are actually working with the SQL command object. It's exactly the same, because if you look at this select command property, it actually is the select command. If you look at the IntelliSense here, it's actually a SQL command object, meaning if you know how to work with SQL command object, then it's pretty much easy to work with SQL data adapter object. Okay, so SQL data adapter object dot select command dot parameters dot add, there is a method called add with value, where you can just specify the name of the parameter and the value that you want to pass for that parameter. So the name of the parameter here is at product ID. So that's the name of the parameter, and the next thing that you have to pass in is the value for that parameter. So where is this value coming from? This value is coming from this text box. So the ID of the text box is text box 1, so text box 1.text. That's it. So we specified that it's a stored procedure, and then you associated this parameter to this procedure. That's it. So let's run this, and then once we type the product ID into the text box control and click this button, we should get that specific product. Let's say I want the product with ID 2, get product, and I only get that product there. So we have seen how to execute a stored procedure with a parameter as well. Now there is another way you can do this. Instead of passing to the constructor, here if you look at this, the SQL data adapter is actually taking in these two parameters. Okay, now there is another version, overloaded constructor of SQL adapter, which doesn't take any parameters. So if I create a SQL data adapter like this, then I need to specify the adapter's select command. So data adapter.select command, and if you remember, this select command property is actually expecting a SQL command object. So if you know how to work with SQL command object, all you do is to create a new SQL command object and then specify the command text and the connection object. So let's say the command here is SP, that's the procedure, and the connection that we want to use is the connection object. Okay, so we have that SQL command here, and we are associating the command type as we are telling that command type is stored procedure, and to the select command we are adding a parameter which it expects. So now if I run, the output would exactly be the same, except that we are doing it in a slightly different way. So I enter product ID 1, click get product, and I get